Okay, so you want to own an airport, not a shop inside one, not an airline that flies out of one. The airport itself, the runways, the terminals, the tarmac, 200,000 people cross every single day without a single competitor allowed to build next door. No rival can open a second Heathrow across the street. No startup can undercut you on landing fees. It sounds like the cleanest monopoly on earth, the final boss of infrastructure investing. And in one very specific way, that's true. But here's the part nobody mentions before you hand over billions of dollars for the privilege. You don't get to decide how much profit you make. A government regulator does. And the fortune everyone imagines when they picture owning an airport isn't actually where the money lives. Let's start with who's really in that ownership seat right now, because it's almost never who people assume. And once you see who's actually writing the checks, the rest of the business starts to make a lot more sense. Take Heathrow, Europe's busiest airport, 84 million passengers a year, and for decades its majority owner was a Spanish construction and infrastructure company called Ferrovial. In November 2023, Ferrovial announced it was selling out entirely. The buyers weren't an airline. They weren't a government. They were a French private equity firm called Ardian and Saudi Arabia's public investment fund. By December 2024, Ardian had built a 22.6% stake. Infrastructure funds don't buy airports because they're excited about air travel. They buy them because an airport is one of the closest things in the world to a government bond that also has a shopping mall attached. Predictable, monopolistic, almost impossible to disrupt. That's the entire pitch to their investors. Which means the romance of owning an airport, the glamour, the control tower, the deal closing photo was never really the point. The point was the cash flow. Steady, boring, bond-like cash flow at a scale normal investors could never touch. But steady doesn't mean unrestricted. And this is where the fantasy runs straight into a wall. So, here's the whole airport business model in one sentence. You own a monopoly, and in exchange for owning a monopoly, a regulator tells you exactly how much you're allowed to charge for it. Heathrow operates under something called a Regulated Asset Base, or RAB, a system the UK's Civil Aviation Authority uses because Heathrow, in plain terms, is a legal monopoly. There's no alternative hub for most of the airlines that need to be there. So instead of letting the airport charge whatever the market will bear, the CA sets a maximum amount Heathrow can collect per passenger, recalculated every 5 years. During the current regulatory period, that cap has averaged around £28.40 per passenger. For 2026 specifically, the ceiling sits at £26.37. Every single passenger who walks through security is, in effect, a metered unit of revenue with a price the airport didn't set. And airlines fight this number constantly. When the CAA proposed the next 5-year charging range, between £27.20 and £30.50 per passenger for the 2027 to 2031 period, Virgin Atlantic pushed back publicly, warning that the final settlement must prevent passengers paying for an unjustified level of shareholder returns. Airlines have every incentive to keep that number as low as possible, because every pound the airport is allowed to charge is a pound that comes straight out of the airline's margin or straight out of your ticket price. The airport and the airline are locked in a permanent tug of war over a number neither of them fully controls. So when you imagine owning an airport and picture setting your own prices the way a landlord sets rent, that's not the business you actually bought. You bought a monopoly with a government-issued leash on it. Here's where it gets genuinely clever, though, because the leash isn't just a limit. It's also a guarantee. Under the RAB model, everything Heathrow spends on infrastructure, new terminals, baggage systems, security lanes, gets added to a running total called the Regulated Asset Base. At the end of 2023, that total stood at £19.8 billion, on track to pass $20 billion. And here's the mechanism that makes infrastructure investors line up for this. The regulator doesn't just let Heathrow recover what it spends. It guarantees a rate of return on top of it, calculated using something called the Weighted Average Cost of Capital, or WACC. For the upcoming 5-year period, the regulator's proposed WACC sits around 5.9%. Heathrow argues it should be closer to 6.8%. Either way, that percentage gets applied to the entire £20 billion asset base every single year and gets baked directly into what airlines are allowed to be charged. Spend more building the airport, and your guaranteed return grows with it. This is why the ownership fight over Heathrow was never really about planes. It was a fight over the size of the number that a fixed percentage gets multiplied against. The airport's runway isn't just infrastructure. It's the principal on a government-sanctioned bond that keeps growing every time someone builds something new. Anyway, if breakdowns like this are useful to you, subscribing is the easiest way to make sure the next one lands in front of you. This channel does one thing: pull real numbers out of businesses everyone assumes they understand and show you what's actually underneath. There's a new one most weeks. So where does the rest of the money come from? The part that isn't locked inside a regulated formula at all? It's called non-aeronautical revenue, and it covers everything that isn't a landing fee: retail, food and beverage, parking, car rental, real estate, advertising. Globally, according to Airports Council International, non-aeronautical income reached roughly $73 billion in 2024, and at major hub airports, it can make up well over a third of total revenue, sometimes closer to 40%. This is the part of the business the regulator mostly leaves alone because it isn't a captive charge on airlines. It's commerce. And commerce, unlike landing fees, has no price cap. Inside that commerce, one category dominates everything else: duty-free retail. Depending on the airport, duty-free can account for anywhere from 40 to as much as 80% of total retail concession revenue. Airports don't run these shops themselves. They lease the space to operators like Lagardère Travel Retail or Dufry, then take a cut, often reported as high as 40% of what the retailer sells. Car parking is nearly as important on its own. Roughly a quarter of all non-aeronautical revenue at major North American hubs comes from parking alone. And here's a detail worth sitting with. European airports generate more than $10 of non-aeronautical revenue per passenger, on average, while North American airports generate under $6. Same industry, same basic layout of shops and car parks. Nearly double the yield, because European hubs have leaned harder into treating the terminal itself as retail real estate rather than a waiting room. Some airports have turned this into an art form. Singapore's Changi Airport built its entire brand around the terminal as destination idea: a butterfly garden, a rooftop pool, an indoor waterfall 4 stories tall. Precisely because every extra minute a passenger spends enjoying the building is another minute they might spend money in it. Abu Dhabi International took a quieter but equally telling path. Its duty-free retail revenue climbed from 504 million dirhams in 2009 to over 809 million by 2012, a 60% jump in 3 years, driven almost entirely by passenger growth and rising spend per head rather than any change to the runways outside. None of that shows up in a regulator's per-passenger charge calculation. It shows up in the one line of the business the airport actually gets to run like an entrepreneur. This is the part of owning an airport that actually behaves like a normal business, because it's the part where the airport gets to act like a landlord instead of a regulated utility. Every square foot past security becomes a rent negotiation. Every gate becomes a captive audience with nowhere else to spend the 2 hours before boarding. The runway is the government contract. The terminal is the shopping mall. Nobody buys an airport for the runway. There's a third layer to this, though, and it's the strangest one, because it's not really about money changing hands with the airport at all. It's about scarcity and who gets to sell it. At a constrained hub like Heathrow, capped at roughly 10,500 weekly movements and running at 99% of that capacity, the right to land a plane at a specific time becomes a tradable asset in its own right, a slot. In 2015, American Airlines paid Scandinavian Airlines $60 million for a single slot pair. In 2016, Oman Air paid Air France KLM $75 million for one early morning pair, still the highest publicly reported slot transaction on record. In 2017, SAS sold 2 more pairs to American for another $75 million combined. Go back further, and in 2008, Continental paid $209 million for 4 pairs just to launch daily service to Houston and Newark. These aren't ticket revenues. These are one-time payments between airlines for the right to exist at a specific airport at a specific hour, and the airport itself often isn't even the one collecting the check. Why would anyone pay tens of millions of dollars for a 15-minute window that isn't even physical property? Because at a hub this constrained, a slot is the only way in. There is no second Heathrow to build. There is no extra runway sitting unused. The airport's scarcity, the very thing regulators are trying to keep in check on the pricing side, becomes, on the airline side, one of the most valuable trading instruments in the entire industry. The airport doesn't even need to raise its own prices to profit from this. It just needs to stay full. That's also why airlines like EasyJet, the UK's biggest low-cost carrier, have never managed to build a large, profitable Heathrow operation the way they have at less constrained airports. There simply aren't enough spare slots to build the kind of scale a low-cost model depends on. Scarcity doesn't just create a trading market. It quietly decides which business models are even allowed to exist at that airport in the first place. Not every airport gets Heathrow's guarantee, though. And the difference between the ones that do and the ones that don't is one of the biggest hidden risks in this entire industry. Cross the Atlantic to John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York, and you'll find a completely different bet being placed. In 2022, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey broke ground on a $9.5 billion project called the New Terminal 1, a 2.4 million square foot replacement for JFK's aging Terminal 1, financed almost entirely by private investors led by the infrastructure arm of Ferrovial, the very same company that used to own Heathrow. But this deal was built on a completely different foundation. There's no regulated asset base here. No guarantee-back. The developers raised the money through special facilities revenue bonds, over $5.9 billion worth, backed not by any government promise, but by the terminal's own future passenger revenue. If passengers don't show up in the numbers projected, the bondholders don't get made whole by a regulator. They just don't get paid. And the project has already tested that structure. The opening, originally targeted for mid-2025, slipped to 2026. By some reporting, total debt on the project has climbed past $6 billion while construction continues. What one aviation outlet bluntly called the $6 billion debt clock ticking on a terminal that still isn't finished. Compare that to Heathrow, where a cost overrun gets folded into next year's passenger charge almost automatically. At JFK's New Terminal 1, a delay is a cash flow problem the investors have to absorb directly, with no regulator standing behind them to guarantee a return on the extra spend. Same asset class, same word, airport. Two completely different risk profiles, depending entirely on which country's legal system decided how you get paid. This is the detail that separates an airport investment that behaves like a bond from an airport investment that behaves like a construction project with airline logos on it. If you're buying into the regulated version, the government has effectively promised you a return no matter what happens to traffic. If you're buying into the private demand risk version, you're betting your own capital that passengers will actually show up on schedule in the numbers your model assumed, in a terminal that opens on time. Two owners, two airports, radically different odds of ever getting hurt. Which brings us to the part of this business almost nobody accounts for when they picture the payoff, the capital it takes to keep that scarcity from becoming an emergency. In August 2025, Heathrow submitted a formal proposal for a third runway and new terminal complex. The price tag, £49 billion. £21 billion of that is the runway and airfield itself, including rerouting part of the M25 motorway through a tunnel underneath the airport. Another $15 billion is earmarked for terminal modernization. For comparison, Manchester Airport built an entire new Terminal 2 for $1.2 billion, roughly a tenth of what Heathrow says its terminal work alone will cost. The plan is marketed as 100% privately financed, no direct call on the taxpayer. But read the fine print, and the financing model is a lot less private than it sounds. The way Heathrow recovers that spend is through the exact same regulated charge we just talked about. Planning costs alone, before a single shovel goes into ground, are already projected to exceed £1 billion, and the CAA has already approved Heathrow clawing back £320 million of those early costs through higher charges starting in 2028. And Heathrow's own record on cost control gives regulators reason to be nervous. One recent tunnel refurbishment project under the runways was originally forecast at £66 million. The final cost came in at over $555 million, an overrun of 840% on a single piece of infrastructure most passengers will never see. Willie Walsh, the former boss of British Airways parent company IG, put it bluntly during an earlier expansion fight. We have zero confidence in Heathrow's management ability to deliver this project while keeping airport charges flat. The people flying through Heathrow next year are, in part, pre-funding a runway they may never personally use, and if the build runs over the way that tunnel did, the regulator's formula means passengers are the ones left holding the difference. And the UK has a track record here worth knowing beyond Heathrow itself. HS2, the country's last mega infrastructure project, was forecast at £35 billion in 2010. Current estimates put it closer to $100 billion, nearly 3 times over budget and years behind schedule. Heathrow's own £49 billion figure is the airport's number. Independent estimates run higher. Every airport expansion carries this same structural trap. The capital has to be spent years before the extra passengers who will pay it back ever arrive, and if the project runs over, which infrastructure projects of this size very often do, there's only one place left to recover the difference: the people already walking through the gates. Owning an airport doesn't mean collecting rent on a finished asset. It means being permanently, unavoidably, on the hook to keep building the asset you already own and being contractually rewarded for how big you're willing to let that asset get. So put the whole picture together. You buy and expecting a monopoly that prints money on autopilot. What you actually get is 4 separate businesses stitched into one balance sheet. One, a regulated utility with a government-capped ceiling on the aeronautical side, but a guaranteed percentage return on every pound you pour into the asset base, as long as your legal system agrees to that structure in the first place. 2, a retail landlord operation that only really pays off if you out-execute other airports on square footage per passenger, the way Changi and Abu Dhabi have. 3, a scarcity market where the most valuable trades happen between airlines themselves, with the airport merely setting the stage and controlling the guest list. 4, a permanent multi-billion-pound capital treadmill that never stops needing to be fed. One that either gets absorbed automatically into tomorrow's passenger charge, the way it does at Heathrow, or lands directly on the investor's own balance sheet the moment a project runs late, the way it has at JFK. None of that is a scam. It's simply a completely different business than the one the word airport makes people imagine. It isn't a business you run for excitement. It's a business you run for yield, patient, monopolistic, 30-year horizon yield, which is exactly why the people writing the biggest checks for airports today aren't romantic aviation enthusiasts. They're pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, the same investors who buy toll roads and power grids, looking for one thing: a cash flow so boring and so protected from competition that nothing short of a regulator can touch it. The runway isn't the price. The formula that guarantees a return on it, decade after decade, is. And here's what's easy to miss in all of this. Somebody has to actually pour that 49 billion pounds of concrete. The construction firm building Heathrow's third runway doesn't have to wait 30 years for regulated cash flow to trickle in. It doesn't absorb the risk if passenger forecasts come in soft, or if a project runs 800% over budget the way that tunnel refurbishment did. It gets paid on contract, in stages, regardless of whether the airport's decades-long bet on the future ever fully pays off. Which raises a very different question. If the airport owner is the one carrying all the risk on a 49 billion pound gamble, who's the one actually getting paid the moment the shovel hits the ground, and keeps getting paid no matter how the story ends? That's the business we're breaking down next. The economics of owning a construction company.